Hello everyone, how are you doing? Welcome again to Traveling Among Books. These days I have been quite busy trying to find poetry that interests me. As you may know, poetry is not one of my fortes. It's something that it's a bit complicated for me and maybe makes the process of reading a bit overwhelming. That's why I set myself the task of looking for poems with themes that really interest me to make the reading more enjoyable. That's when I found Emily Dickinson, who, if you don't know, is one of the greatest poets in history. I started researching and I found this book, The Complete Poems of Emily Dickinson, editing by Thomas Johnson. I found this book on Amazon, but it is also on other platforms like eBay. After I got it, I started reading it with some skepticism of finishing and its entirety. However, I was surprised that the more I read, the more interested I became. And finally, without realizing it, I finished it all. So in today's video, I would like to tell you about this book in order to interest you in this type of literature so complex, but at the same time interested you in literature in general, universal literature. For this, I want to focus on a poem that I really liked, that it's So Proud She Was to Die. I'm only going to talk about this one because I want you to try to read the wide variety of poems by Emily Dickinson and create your own interpretations. Well, now let's start with today's video.
Emily Dickinson was born in Amherst, Massachusetts on December 10, 1830. The Dickinson family had been in America for nearly 200 years, an epoch of dwellers in such a young country. The first Dickinsons arrived in America with John Winthrop in 1630. The family spread across New England, eventually becoming deeply entrenched in the Connecticut River Valley. The Dickinson name became synonymous with power and prestige. Samuel Dickinson, Emily's grandfather, was one of the founders of Amherst College. However, Emily's parents, Edward Dickinson and Emily Norcross, belonged to an impoverished branch of the Dickinson family. Before Emily was born, Edward Dickinson took over his father's law firm. Many years later, Austin Dickinson, Edward's son, would take the firm over from his father. During Dickinson's life, a number of important events and movements took place. A social and religious movement called the Great Revival renewed religious fervor among the people of New England. It resulted in the enclosing of saloons all over Massachusetts and Connecticut. Dickinson's father joined the Great Revival movement in supporting the Temperance Pledge. But Dickinson looked on the movement with skepticism. During the 1840s and 1850s, the abolitionist movement, a social movement organized in the North to abolish the institution of slavery, gained support. On May 30, 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This bill made the Kansas and Nebraska territories full-fledged states. As a result of granting Kansas and Nebraska statehood, the slave debate in America intensified. For the new bill permitted slavery, enraging some United States citizens. The Kansas-Nebraska Act stated that the new states would decide to adopt slavery or not based on popular sovereignty. Leaving the adoption of slavery up to the individual states directly contradicted the Missouri Compromise, which barred the extension of slavery into new states. Edward Dickinson fought vehemently against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The bill passed, and as a result, Edward Dickinson and about 40 other U.S. congressmen began planning an entirely new political party, which would come to be called the Republican Party. The Civil War also touched Emily Dickinson's life. Her brother Austin paid a conscript to take his place in the war, avoiding it, but Emily's great friend Thomas Wentworth Higginson led the first Black regiment in the Union Army, and one of her dearest friend's husbands was killed by an explosion in the conflict. The American literary world was not close to female writers, but it didn't welcome them either. Poetry was considered a man's area, especially in New England. Poets as Ralph Waldo Emerson and Walt Whitman was recognized. Dickinson's father was liberal in some aspects and conservative in others. He would have disapproved if he knew Dickinson spent her time writing in her room, so she kept her massive collection of writings locked in a secret drawer in her room. Dickinson's only published poems were those she sends to friends and family as notes, birthday greetings, and valentines. During her lifetime, Dickinson published only 7 poems on the nearly 2,000 that would be published after her death. During Dickinson's lifetime, almost all of the 7 poems published were published anonymously in the Springfield Republican newspaper. Dickinson, socially brilliant as a young man, became increasingly reclusive as her life progressed. In her early 20s, she began to wear only white. Eventually, she stopped receiving most visitors and even refused to see dear friends who came to her home. Recognition of Dickinson was not realized until years after her death, although Dickinson understood her own genius while she was alive. Many scholars now identify Dickinson's style as a precursor by more than 50 years of modern poetry. At the time Dickinson wrote, the conventions of poetry demanded a strict form. Dickinson's broke meter, unusual rhythmic patterns, and assonance impressed even the respected critics of the time, who considered them sloppy and inept. In time, many of our most revered poets, such as Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, echoed her style. Yet, while she lived, the few publishers failed to appreciate Dickinson's innovation. Dickinson's niece, Martha Dickinson Bianchi, and Dickinson's sister, Lavinia, collected and published some of Dickinson's poetry after her death, but the world was still slow to recognize Dickinson. In 1945, the collection of poems titled Bowls of Melody was published. In 1955, Dickinson's letters and selected commentaries on her life and work were published. And in 1960, her complete poems, edited by Thomas H. Johnson, were published. At last, the world began to recognize Dickinson's innovation and brilliance. Today, Emily Dickinson is appreciated worldwide and recognized as one of the best poets in history. The poet's death on 15 May 1886 came after 2.5 years of ill health. From the time her nephew Gibb died in October 1883, and she suffered a consequent nervous prostration. Dickinson became what her sister termed delicate. On 2 later occasions, she experienced blackouts, and she was confined to bed for the 7 months preceding her death. During the 1880s, Dickinson also endured the loss of several close friends: Charles Wadsworth, Judge Otis P. Lord, and Helen Hunt Jackson, and several family members, including Gibb and her mother. The effect of This strains the symptoms of severe headache and nausea mentioned in her letters, and her deathbed coma, punctuated by raspy and difficult breathing, have led researchers to conclude that she died of heart failure induced by severe hypertension.
Now, with this little contextualization about who Emily Dickinson was and what her life was like, we are going to perform an analysis, both internal and external, of the poem So Proud She Was to Die. This in order to shed light and allow a better understanding of what Emily wanted to express and reflect there. Dickinson's verse is often associated with common matter, which is defined by alternating lines of 8 syllables and 6 syllables. That is this one, 8686. In common matter, the syllables usually alternate between unstressed and stressed syllables. This pattern is known as an iamb. So, well, in this case, in So Proud She Was to Die, Emily Dickinson, in the first line, there are 6 syllables. In the second line, there are 6 syllables also. In the third line, there are 8. In the fourth line, 5. In the fifth line, 6 again. Line number 6, there are 6 syllables. In the line number 7, there are 9 syllables, and in the last line, that is the line number 8, there are 6 syllables. So, as you can see, there are 2 stanzas in this poem with 8 verses and 52 syllables. 6, 6, 8, 5, 6, 6, and 9, 6. So, analyzing the rhyme scheme of this poem is evidence that the rhyme scheme is A, B, C, B, D, E, F, E. That is because in the however, Emily Dickinson experimented with a variety of metrical and stanzic forms, including short meter, that is 6686, and the ballad stanza. Even in common meter, she was not always strict about the number of syllables per line, which is the case of this poem. As you can see in the poem, she alternates lines of 6 syllables, 8 syllables, 5, and finally 9 syllables. Dickinson most often punctuated poems with dashes rather than the more expected array of periods, commas, and other punctuation marks. She also capitalized interior words, not just words at the beginning of a line. Her reasons are not entirely clear. Both the use of dashes and the use of capitals to stress and personify common nouns were condoned by the grammar text. That is William Harvey Wells' Grammar of the English Language, that Mount Holyoke Female Seminary adopted, and that Dickinson could study to prepare herself for entrance to that school. In addition, that the dash was liberally used by many writers. While Dickinson was far from the only person to employ it, she may have been the only poet to depend upon it. While Dickinson's dashes often stand in for more varied punctuation, and other times they serve as bridges between sections of the poem, Dickinson may also have intended for the dashes to indicate pauses when reading the poem aloud. Also, in this poem, many poetic devices are evident, like the following.
One of the poetic devices used by Emily Dickinson in the poem is the euphemism. In the phrase "where none of us should be," this phrase replaced the word "afterlife," maybe because the theme of death was a taboo at that time. Also, the personification is evidenced in the words like anguish and jealousy. Emily Dickinson gives the capacity to anguish to stoop and to be replaced by jealousy. Also, it exists a contrast between feeling of the woman on death, that is proud and satisfaction, with the feelings of the people that are with her, that are fear and ashamed. Also, the metaphor is evidence with the phrase that what we cherished, so unknown to her desire seemed. That what we cherished is a reference to the life, to the desire to survive and not die. Also, the symbolism is used in the phrase "where none of us should be," that is a symbolism of afterlife, and that what we cherished, so unknown to her desire seemed, that is a reference to life. Other poetic device is synecdoche, in the phrase "that what we cherished" and in the word anguish. That what we cherished, this is a part of the life, it's a feeling that is part of it. Many people cherished the life as a really important thing. And the word anguish, this is a feeling that is part of mourning, the death of someone. And finally, Emily Dickinson used paradox with 4 lines. In the first 2 lines, "so proud she was to die, it made us all ashamed." And it's a paradox between proud and ashamed. And the other 2 lines, "so satisfied to go where none of us should be." The paradox is between satisfied and none of us should be.
Considering the tone in which the poem is told, the speaker narrates the poem as distant, but at the same time deeply immersed in the experience of death. She describes death from an objective perspective, from the common perspective of death. But at the same time, he is immersed in describing feelings such as anguish, saying about the moment's death, and his unusual perspective on his own death. This distancing, but at the same time immersion of death, can give a sense of ambiguity to the poem. It shows that death is not only the superficial concept of fear and desolation that it usually represents, but it's a more complex term that implies man's freedom from the stresses, limits, and pains of life. In the title, for example, it is possible to emphasize the words proud and death. These two represent the central idea of the poem. They are the ones that include the message that is evidenced there. It shows us the existing dichotomy between life and death, mainly the fatalistic concept of death that can be seen from another perspective, as well as the satisfaction of the woman to die in front of the discomfort and pain of her relatives with this situation. Because of the way the situation is narrated, it is as if everything was from the perspective of the people close to the woman. The poem begins by repeating the title and then gives way to what I suppose is the perspective of a family member or friend of that woman near death. about what they feel about the unusual attitude of this woman with her future death, emphasizing the word ashamed. A small comparison is made of what they feel with the phrase that what we cherished and how far this thought is from the woman's true desire. In the first stanza, melancholy feelings of sadness are evident in the face of what is happening, that is the future death of the woman, but also a kind of discomfort expressed by the word ashamed with the woman's perspective or on her own death. That is, with this different and unusual view of death, and even more so of herself, when it is more normal to feel great sadness, frustration, and despair. However, it is interesting how Emily Dickinson takes this and changes it abruptly in the second stanza. It will seem that she will continue to express the desolation of these people for the death of the woman, but after telling that the woman was proud to go to that place where they should not be, they show a kind of envy, of jealousy in front of what I consider is finally the death of this woman. It is as if after her death, that feeling of great sadness and despair that the woman left in these people changed the perspective they have about the death, and they prefer to go with her to that place, which I will take as the afterlife. Then to continue suffering and feeling that desolation. The central theme of the poem is death. From the title it is evident. However, there is not shown as something sad. The common feeling of fear is absent from the poem. It is important to realize that Emily Dickinson neither romanticizes death nor glorifies it, but it is realistic about it. For Dickinson, death is an authority that nothing and no one can overcome. The fate of man is strongly subject to it. Death is full of equality. There is no distinction between women and men, black and white, poor or rich. Death sees everyone as equal. Similarly, death is perceived as a liberation from life. Man is constantly subject to rules and to follow an established social code, which makes men being without freedom and identity. And going against this code can lead to social segregation. Death is the desired release from the pains, tensions, and stresses of life. However, it is important to clarify that death is not something detached from life. They are strongly linked. It is death that gives meaning to life. This poem is a clear reflection on the nature of death and man's perspective on it. It introduces to a totally different vision of death and the feelings it can imply in our lives. It allows us to perceive it as something beyond a loss. We can come to recognize it as a kind of freedom. And I feel that this is what I like most about the poem, as it doesn't romanticize or glorify death in an hypothetical way, but sees it realistically and objectively. I was quite struck by the fact that the poem can be means to help us change the schemes that are already imposed in our minds, so that instead of seeing death only as a painful situation, we perceive it as a salvation, a way out of the pain of life. However, it is important to clarify that it doesn't do so from a suicidal feeling, but as a way to face death with dignity and pride. Poetry is an excellent way to express ourselves, our pains, joys, loves, interests, and passions. I recommend reading this poem and creating your own interpretation of it. Since reading poetry like this and even writing it will open new visions about life and all the aspects it includes. In the same way, Emily Dickinson has a great variety of poems that I invite you to read because apart from reflecting on death, she also reflects on the wonders of nature, love, immortality, the identity of the self, among other topics that can be essential to rethink the issues of life. It is definitely a poem that must be read and analyzed several times, since once is not enough to account for all the aspects that are shown there, and some of the messages that can be found implicitly within the poem. However, although one may think that this is a process that can become overwhelming or boring, it is actually a very enriching and pleasant exercise to realize all the poet wanted to express there. It is important to clarify that this type of poems is more suitable for older ages or teenagers, not only because the theme of death is something that is difficult for children to understand, but also because it is a complex poem to read and requires a rich lexicon to be able to read and understand it. For example, I as a future teacher have been thinking about how I can include this poem in the school curriculum and get kids interested in American literature, literature in general, universal literature. I think a central point is to contextualize it to the children's environment, and facing death is something that can be witnessed at any time in life. Through this poem, I can show them that death can be seen from another perspective and help them cope with it more easily in the future. First, I can start the activity by showing a video of who Emily Dickinson was, and then give them a chance to read the poem individually. Then I would allow each student to give his or her point of view and interpretation of the poem in order to jointly analyze the internal and external structure of the poem. After this, I would ask them if their interpretation of the poem had changed, and then each student would write a letter to death, showing the change of perspective on death and how they think they can face it in the future. However, there is a great possibility of ways to deal with poetry in class, and that depends on what we want our students to achieve at the end of the activity. With this, I want to end by sharing with you an epitaph that I constructed by drawing inspiration from the poems that Emily Dickinson wrote throughout her life. Thank you all very much for watching this video, and I hope you like it. It is my hope that you were interested in the book and that you will set out not only to read the poems found there, but to find a motivation to look further and allow yourself to become interested in the great variety of books that are part of literature. I wish you luck with the reading. Any questions you have, you can write them in the comments, and I will try to answer most of them in the following video. See you next time. Bye.